So we are looking now at President Johnson. And so, like I said, in another lecture, we're going to look at civil rights and then Vietnam as individual things. So we're not including those two things in this presentation. But just keep in mind, Johnson is going to be in deep with both civil rights and Vietnam. So we're not going to talk a lot about him right now, but we will circle back to him later on. So let's kind of get you some background of who he is, what's going on. So as I said, he was from Texas. He is a longtime senator from Texas. And so very famously, when he became Kennedy's vice president, once again, Kennedy was trying to find someone who would attract the Dixiecrat vote. Johnson was really almost taking a step down because he was so powerful in the Senate. He was kind of like a lion of the Senate. Johnson and Kennedy very famously didn't really get along well. Kennedy was all about loyalty, and Kennedy was kind of using Johnson in a sense to attract the votes of the Dixiecrats, but didn't really trust him. He really more relied on his brother Bobby, who was the Attorney General. All right, so what happens is, of course, when Kennedy's assassinated, they're all in Dallas, and so Johnson gets sworn in on Air Force One in Dallas the same day Kennedy dies. And then you can see here is Jackie, and she's wearing that very famous pink suit, and she wanted to keep the same pink suit because this pink suit had JFK's blood on it, and she wanted people to see it. And so there's Johnson getting sworn in. Kind of a fun fact, Johnson actually... they didn't have a Bible, so this isn't an actual Bible. This is actually a Catholic missal. He's sworn in on. So before Vatican II, right, Mass was in Latin, and so Catholics would have this book that would help them follow along in the Mass, and so that was actually the book he was sworn in on. Another, just kind of getting a sense of who this guy is. He had a Texas-sized ego. So, for example, one time he was visiting the Vatican and meeting with the Pope, and he gave the Pope a bust of himself as a present. And like I said, he had this long career in the White House, or a long career rather in the Senate, and he'd give people what's called the Johnson treatment. So he's a tall guy, so he'd lean over them and get, an inch or two away from their face and just start almost yelling at them, giving them the Johnson treatment, leaning in, really being kind of this intimidating figure. And then, of course, he's known as Johnson, but also LBJ, Lyndon B. Johnson. His wife was Lady Bird Johnson, so LBJ. And to keep it in the family, they named their dog Little Beagle Johnson. So the Little Beagle Johnson was also an LBJ as well. And so when Johnson takes over, he does keep a lot of Kennedy's men and a lot of Kennedy's policy as well. And so a way to kind of think of Johnson in general sense, you can think of him as a mixture between Abraham Lincoln and FDR. Lincoln because he does a lot with civil rights, and then FDR because he does a lot of social welfare programs. And so we'll look at that right now. So War on Poverty. This is, once again, Johnson was a fanboy of FDR. Johnson wanted to continue FDR's legacy of these social programs. And so the War on Poverty was an effort to fight poverty, especially in the Appalachians, where there was thousands of these unemployed coal miners. And so he spent about $1 billion to fight poverty. So his War on Poverty. Like I said, specifically, he's looking at these unemployed Appalachian coal miners. And his Great Society, that is his domestic policy. If you were to name it, you'd say it's the Great Society. And Congress is going to pass a lot of these New Deal style programs that Johnson proposes. Like I said, he's going to have a focus on civil rights. He's going to expand who's covered under Social Security. He's having immigration reform, so he's getting rid of the quota system that's been around since the 1920s. But a lot of both of these things really wither because of all the money that's being poured into Vietnam at the time. And so we're going to see here is, he's just trying, he has too many coals in the fire, too many fires in the coal if you say that. Okay, so you go over here. The 88th Congress is doing whatever he asked them to do. You can see there's the Congress as the piano. And you have anti-poverty legislation, Southeast Asia resolution, as in that's Vietnam, civil rights bill, defense money. And then over here you have this prize cattle, because, you know, he's from Texas. And so Vietnam, education, foreign aid, war and poverty. And so really what happens is he has a lot of ideas, but his presidency is going to be marked in large part by Vietnam, and there's just not enough money to go around to make these programs stick. But he's going to have the best civil rights records of any president since Lincoln. And we'll look at this later, but the Civil Rights Act of 64, the Voting Rights Act of 65, these are huge milestones in the civil rights movement, and it's going to be Johnson who signs them into law. Okay, one more thing with Johnson we'll look at is the 6 Days War. And so this is just a little review to remind ourselves what's happening in Israel. So remember, Israel's created after World War II as a homeland for the Jews. And so a lot of Arab nations aren't a fan of Israel because Israel was kind of born out of their land, and Israel also has a different religion. They have a different culture, and the Arab nations really resent the creation of Israel. And so the 6 Days War is when Syria, Jordan, and Egypt are going to attack Israel, kind of a joint attack, but it is going to be backed by the Soviets. So once again, this is definitely part of the Cold War. So the United States is going to support Israel, and then Syria, Jordan, and Egypt are each going to be backed by the Soviets as well. And as you can tell, it lasts about 6 days. And in the end, Israel is going to win. And when Israel wins, they get themselves some more territory. So Israel wins, and they get a couple pieces of territory right here. So they get the Gaza Strip over here. They get the West Bank. They get the Golan Heights up here. But perhaps most importantly, they get the Sinai Peninsula, which was traditionally held by Egypt. So they get the Sinai Peninsula, they get the Gaza Strip, they get the West Bank, they get the Golan Heights. And so you can see all of these kind of striped areas is land taken by Israel after this 6 days war. And so, Israel is sitting pretty with this. And we're just going to mention this now, but we're going to backtrack, or we'll revisit this again, because this is only chapter 1 of a longer saga, because there's going to be another war, and then there's going to be a peace treaty. So just know we're going to be circling back to this. But this is, of course, happening during Johnson's presidency. All right, we're moving on to Richard Nixon, 1969 to his resignation in 1974. So we're going to talk about Nixon just kind of in general first. So Nixon is a Republican, right? He had been the VP for Eisenhower. There's Eisenhower and Nixon laughing about something, I'm sure very funny. And Nixon had also been the person who was prosecuting Alger Hiss, that spy trial. And so Nixon had been around for a while. And so he was the Republican nominee. And what's happening, though, is in 1969, the Democrats are having a heck of a time. The Vietnam War is dividing the Democrats in half. And so in 1968, the Democrats have their national convention in which they choose who's going to represent them in the election. And there is this more or less riot that breaks out in 1968 Democratic Convention. So it's held in Chicago, and a lot of anti-war protesters are showing up. And at the time, Daley is in charge of Chicago. This is getting a little bit too in the weeds, but whatever. The mayor of Chicago, who's kind of notoriously corrupt, Daley is in charge of Chicago and doesn't like these protesters. He wants his city to be seen as this kind of clean-cut city, doesn't like all of these out-of-towners showing up and making trouble. And so Daley sends the police in on the protesters, and it turns into a police riot. And that is all over the newspapers. And we see the Democratic Party. This is just an example of the Democratic Party kind of seeing that division for those who are for or against Vietnam. And so we're going to see this division in the Democratic Party clear the way for a Republican victory. And so we're Republican victory. So we see Nixon taken power. All right. So we're going to look at a couple of things with Nixon here. One is we're going to see a growth of environmental protection during Nixon's administration. And it's really kicked off by Rachel Carson. So Rachel Carson wrote this book called The Silent Spring. So if you go outside in the spring, you'll hear a lot of critters. You'll hear a lot of insects making noise. It'll be pretty loud in the spring. But The Silent Spring is a book kind of talking specifically about the dangers of pesticides and how that's ruining the environment. And so she's kind of an environmental muckraker, really trying to draw people's attention to these different practices that are hurting the natural environment. And so Rachel Carson, kind of our muckraker, if you will, is writing this book, The Silent Spring, and it kind of kicks off this movement. This is also when we see Earth Day being formed. So we're going to see April 22nd being forever inaugurated as Earth Day. And we're going to see a lot of federal regulation that's going to help kind of put an end to some pollution. So I'm just going to give you one as an example. So like the Clean Air Act. So the Clean Air Act of 1970. That's going to be some federal regulation on air pollution. And so we're going to see the government even getting involved with some regulations to protect the environment. So we talked about Earth, let's talk about the moon. So as we talked about before, we had the space race with the Soviets. It started with Sputnik in 1957, and it's going to end with the Apollo 11 mission in 1969. And so this is when we're going to land a man on the moon. And so we do this July 20th of 1969. And so here you can see there's some people, here's the Pope watching the moon landing here. People across the world are very much engaged in watching this happen. Okay, so you don't need to write this down, but just so you can see, NASA, as I said, was created kind of in response to Sputnik. So 1958, NASA was created, and you can see they had different projects they're working on. They had Gemini, Mercury, but the Apollo program is the program that was really geared towards landing a man on the moon. And so the Apollo program is the one that's going to get us on the moon. And so you can see these are different parts of the Apollo program. We can see Apollo 11's the one going to land us on the moon. Apollo 13, there's a Tom Hanks movie about Apollo 13. There's a malfunction and they had to get the men back safely to Earth, which they do. And then you can see the last mission to the moon from the United States was in 1972. It was the last time the U.S. landed a man on the moon or had a man walk around on the moon. So Apollo 11 is the program. These are our 3 astronauts from Apollo 11. Of course, we have Neil Armstrong, Michael Collins, and Buzz Aldrin. Neil Armstrong is the first man who lands on the moon. Buzz Aldrin also walks on the moon. Michael Collins is a part of the mission, but he never actually, he didn't actually do the walk. And so Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin spend about 2.5 hours on the surface of the moon. Okay, now we have Nixon and his trip to Beijing and to Moscow. So remember, we're talking about communists during the Cold War. We're talking about China that became communist. Mao took over. And then we have, of course, Moscow, which is the Soviet Union. And so this is a step towards détente, or a lessening of the tensions in the Cold War. So Nixon, there he is by the Great Wall, visits Beijing in February of 1972. And of course, a U.S. president hadn't visited a leader of China since China became communist. And so this is a big step towards kind of normalizing relations with China. By doing this, we're also kind of accepting the one China policy, which meant lessening our commitment to an independent Taiwan. Remember, during the Chinese Civil War, the losers or the nationalists had set up camp in Taiwan. And so now what we're doing is we're actually visiting the communist leader in Beijing, and that's kind of supporting more of a one China policy, meaning that we're really recognizing the true China as the communist China, not necessarily supporting Taiwan. Okay. And then so in February, he went to Beijing. And then in May, he's going to visit Moscow. And the idea is, once again, this is ushering in an era of détente, or relaxing of the tensions. Why he's in Moscow, you can see there is the premier over there, or the leader of the Soviet Union. While he's in Moscow, he agreed to sell grain to the Soviets for 3 years. So we're actually selling grain to the Soviets. And also agreed to SALT, which is Strategic Arms Limitation Talks. So oftentimes they're like SALT talks, but SALT is Strategic Arms Limitation Talks. And anytime we have kind of like a SALT talk, that's a good thing, because that's going to help us kind of limit the stockpile of weapons we have going. And so this trip to Beijing and Moscow, once again, it's Nixon's attempt to bring some sort of normalcy to the world during the Cold War, trying to kind of play nice with our Soviet comrades, if you will. Okay, next, we're going to review, and then we're moving forward. But remember, like I said, we had the 6 Days War. Now this is kind of part 2. So remember, the 6 Days War is when Israel was attacked by its Arab neighbors, but Israel won, and they took a bunch of land, right? They got the Sinai Peninsula, they got the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, Golan Heights. They'd taken all of that land. Well, now this is part 2, and this is called the Yom Kippur War. So, the Yom Kippur War was 6 years after the 6 Days War. So this is 6 years later. And what's going to happen is, this is an attack on Israel by Syria and Egypt. And they attacked Israel on Yom Kippur. So Yom Kippur is the Day of Atonement. It's the holiest day in the Jewish year. And so they figured it would be a good idea to attack Israel, where a lot of people were distracted with Yom Kippur. And so we see Syria is attacking in the north. They want the Golan Heights back. Egypt is attacking kind of in the south there. They want the Sinai Peninsula back. And once again, what happens is the Soviets are going to support Syria and Egypt, and the United States is going to support Israel. So when the Yom Kippur War breaks out, Nixon places nuclear forces on alert, because this could be something that would lead to something else. So nuclear forces are on alert. And the U.S. is going to airlift about $2 billion in war materials to aid Israel. So the United States is going to give about $2 billion in war materials to Israel. And it's going to end in this kind of very uneasy ceasefire. No land is going to exchange hands. It's just going to have a ceasefire. But there's, of course, still consequences. So OPEC, right, who's the oil cartel, isn't very happy with the United States for supporting Israel. And so OPEC announces an embargo on the US and other European countries who had helped out Israel during this Yom Kippur War. And so an oil embargo means they're not going to sell us oil. So once again, kind of the era of cheap gas is forever gone after the Yom Kippur War. And we're going to see long lines at gas stations. We're going to see they're going to decrease the speed limit to 55 miles an hour as a way to save on gas as well. So for 5 months, there's an oil embargo, and the United States is definitely going to feel that. Like I said, you can see here's pictures of people, lining up around the block to get a chance to get oil or to get gas. You can see the speed limit changing from 70 to 55. And once again, it's OPEC kind of wagging their finger at the United States saying, you can't get away with that now. Okay, let's move on. Okay, so of course you can't talk about Nixon without talking about Watergate. And once again, I'm doing just the basic bare bones version of what happened with Watergate. So, this is the scandal which is going to cause Nixon to resign. Okay, so Watergate is a office apartment complex in D.C. All right, Nixon, of course, is a Republican, and the idea is there's a committee called CREEP. They call themselves CREEP, the Committee to Re-elect the President. So this committee who's in charge with trying to get Nixon reelected, is caught in the Democratic Party's headquarters, which is housed inside of the Watergate complex. So, of course, remember, political parties were never a part of the Constitution, so they have no formal office space. And so the Democrats, the enemies of Nixon, if you will, the Democrats had their office space in Watergate. And what happened is 5 men from CREEP were found bugging the Democratic Party's offices. And so these 5 men are caught bugging the offices. And Nixon at first says, I had nothing to do with this. I had no knowledge, no prior knowledge. He says this has nothing to do with him and he's not connected with it at all. All right. But as it's investigated further, they realize that Nixon tapes all of his conversations in the Oval Office. And so when they're investigating, they said, hand over the tapes. We want the tapes. You're innocent? Fine. Hand over the tapes. And so Nixon does hand over the tapes, but he only hands over the relevant portion of the tapes. And so a lot of the tapes will have huge sections of them just missing. And he's citing executive privilege. He's saying, I have executive privilege, so I, as president, am only going to hand over the relevant portions of the tapes. Sure. Well, the Supreme Court says, Nixon, executive privilege isn't a thing. You made that up. That's not in the Constitution. And so at this point, the House of Representatives starts to draw up papers of impeachment. And so kind of the writing's on the wall for Nixon. Because remember, to get impeached, half of the House has to vote for it. And so if at least half the House votes for impeachment, then it goes to a trial in front of the Senate. And then after the trial, 2/3 of the Senate have to vote to actually kick out the president. And Nixon really doesn't want his dirty laundry aired in front of the country. He really doesn't want to go on trial. And so instead of facing possible impeachment trial, he decides instead just to resign. And so this Watergate scandal brings down Nixon, and he resigns August 8th of 1974. And instead of saying, "Hail to the chief," people started to sing, "Jail to the chief." Wow. All right. Moving on, Gerald Ford. So Ford, there's not a whole lot to say about him, but we'll give you a little background on him. So he's the first president who no one ever voted for. So let's talk about how that happened. So let's talk about Ford. So Nixon's first vice president had resigned earlier. So his vice president had resigned early on when he was when there was proof shown that he had accepted some bribes when he had been governor. Long story short, the first vice president that Nixon had run with had resigned. And so Nixon replaced his vice president, appointed a congressman from Michigan, Ford, as his vice president. And so when Nixon resigned, then Ford took over. And so Ford, no one had ever voted for Ford, right? He had not run with Nixon. No one ever cast a vote for Ford. But here he was, the first president that no one, ever voted for. Okay, so just some things about Ford in general. A lot of people tried to paint him as this kind of dim-witted former college football player. Former President Johnson said he couldn't walk and chew gum at the same time. And so he's really seen as kind of this dim-witted person, or at least portrayed as that. And also, he's going to formally pardon Nixon. And so Nixon is not going to actually be tried at all. So Nixon gets off the hook. You can see Ford pardons Nixon, who regrets his mistakes. And so Nixon gets off the hook because of Ford's pardon. All right, so let's look at just one thing for Ford. So once again, we're talking about détente, and a good step towards détente is the Helsinki Accords. So in case you don't know your geography of Finland, Helsinki, there you go, is a map, is of course in Finland. And so we're going to see Ford, and then this is Brezhnev, meet together. And so so we've had Stalin, right? Stalin died in 1953. And then we had Khrushchev. And then after he backed down during the Cuban Missile Crisis, Khrushchev was seen as really weak for backing down, for compromising, and so he lost favor, and so we see Brezhnev around now. Anyway, so Brezhnev's going to be there from 1964 to 1982, just FYI. So, what's happening with Helsinki? And so once again, it's a milestone of détente, a lessening of tensions. And so what's going to happen is America is going to promise to share grain and technology with the Soviet Union, but the United States gets nothing in return. And so a lot of people were very critical about this move because, like I said, it was really kind of one-sided. We're giving grain and technology to the Soviets. We really get nothing in return. And also a lot of people are saying, why are we trying to make nice with the Soviets? There's a lot of human rights that are being violated. We shouldn't really try to make nice with them. So he was criticized for these accords, but this is maybe the one thing we'd mentioned with Ford. He's going to only be around for about 3 years as president. All right. Détente. That's right. Lessening of tensions. All right, let's move forward. So next and last, we have Jimmy Carter. So Jimmy Carter is going to be from 1977 to 1981. And so let's talk about who Jimmy Carter is. So Jimmy Carter is a Democrat, right? Not a Republican, a Democrat. And he was a peanut farmer. So he was a peanut farmer who became governor of Georgia. So you can see he's, running for the governor of Georgia. And he was a born-again Baptist. And so he really presented himself as someone you could trust. He very famously, when he was running, he said, I'd never lie to you. Because it was clear, and we'll see some scandals break besides Watergate when we're talking about Vietnam. But after all of this drama with Nixon, we're going to see people just want an outsider. So he's presenting himself as an outsider of D.C. He's not a career politician. He's this born-again Baptist. He's someone who will never lie to you. And he is there to clean up, D.C. after Nixon. The problem he has, a lot of historians will say, is that he stayed an outsider. So he came in as an outsider, but he really stayed as an outsider. He really rubbed congressmen and his advisors the wrong way. And so Jimmy Carter really never learned how to play the game, if you will. So let's look at some things he did. So this is part 3 of the drama we've been talking about with Israel. Remember, we had the 6 Days War, and then we had the Yom Kippur War, and now we have the Camp David Accords. And so let's talk about Camp David really briefly before we talk about the Accords. So Camp David is a presidential retreat house. It's been around since FDR, and you can see here's DC right here, and then approximately this is where Camp David is. And so Carter has the president of Egypt meet with the prime minister of Israel to kind of smooth out relations after the Yom Kippur War. Because remember, the 6 Days War, the Yom Kippur War, both of those ended in a ceasefire, and it was a very uneasy peace. And so Carter has the president of Egypt and the prime minister of Israel meet together with him at Camp David, and they write these Camp David Accords. The Accords, more or less, Israel gave back the land taken during the 6 Days War, right? So Israel gave Egypt back the Sinai Peninsula. And in return, Egypt promises to respect Israel's border. Egypt promises not to attack Israel again. And so this is a huge, measure forward with peace in Israel, or at least I should say with Israel and its neighbors. Some fun facts about Camp David. Camp David was named after Eisenhower's grandson. So there is David Eisenhower, who Camp David was named after. And also another fun fact, of course, with David Eisenhower is he married Richard Nixon's daughter. So Eisenhower's grandson, David, married Nixon's daughter. There they are, right there. Fun fact. I know, you're so excited. Let's move on to Iran. Okay. So, this is a review. Iran. We talked about a coup already. So remember, this is review. So we had the CIA go into Iran, and we put in charge of Iran the Shah of Iran, the king of Iran, and the Shah was pro-West, pro-Western oil companies. Well, now that's about to change. So back in 53, we had installed the Shah of Iran, and now in 79, we're going to have a violent revolution who's going to kick out the Shah of Iran. So let's talk about this Iranian revolution. So, a lot of Muslim fundamentalists really resented the Shah, right? The Shah, or the king, was really secular. He was really pro-West. And so they wanted to get rid of him. And they really resented the United States. They called the United States the Great Satan. And so this revolution is Muslim fundamentalists who are taking back Iran. And the idea is there's a lot of chaos that's ensuing in this. And once again, this is going to stop Iran's oil supply. And once again, we're going to have gas shortages and long lines at the gas station again. And so Muslim fundamentalists are taking back Iran. And this, of course, brings us to the Iran hostage crisis. This is probably something you've heard of before. So during this Iranian revolution, the U.S. embassy is stormed by anti-American Muslims. So remember, America was a symbol of kind of the great Satan, if you will. And so the U.S. embassy is overrun, and 66 Americans are taken hostage. And they're taken hostage for a long time. They'll be taken hostage for 444 days. 444 days, 66 Americans. And the idea is this is what they wanted. They wanted the United States to return the Shah back to Iran. The Shah, the king of Iran, the person the revolutionaries do not like, he had been in the United States getting cancer treatments, and they want to put him on trial for crimes. And so they're saying, if you give us back the Shah, we'll release these hostages. Well, Carter says, I'm not going to yield to blackmail. So Carter refuses to give up the Shah. And there was one failed attempt to rescue some of the men. This is a side note. It was called Operation Eagle Claw. And in the process of trying to rescue these hostages, two aircrafts collided, leaving 6 dead. So we tried to get them out of there. It didn't work. And eventually this is going to end after 444 days when Iraq invades Iran. So we'll talk about that later. But when Iraq invades Iran, Iran's like, we have bigger fish to fry, and releases the hostages, just minutes after President Reagan is sworn in. So these 66 Americans are held hostage from November of 79 to January of 81. All right, last topic here. So last thing with Carter is the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. What is happening? I know, right? What is happening? This is a very random thing. So of course we'll talk about Vietnam. And Vietnam is kind of a hot mess for the United States. We thought it should be an easy war, but we get bogged down. It lasts forever. We get in over our heads. So a lot of people will say the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan is like the Vietnam for Afghanistan, meaning it's they pay a really high price for it and it drags out over a long period of time. So during the Iranian Revolution, while the United States is like paying attention to what's happening there, the Soviets take the opportunity to invade Afghanistan. The idea is they wanted some of the oil of the Persian Gulf. And like I said, this is Russia's Vietnam. It's going to be 9 years where they're really bogged down by a lot of guerrilla warfare. It's during this time that the United States boycotts the Olympics that are held in Moscow because we are not super happy about their invasion of Afghanistan. Also, in retaliation for this action, the United States places an embargo on the export of grain and technology to the USSR. So the Helsinki Accords, forget about it. You invaded Afghanistan, we're going to have an embargo in place against you. And so we'll look at this later, but of course, we are going to be supporting, to some extent, the people in Afghanistan. And so during this invasion, the US is going to support a lot of people in Afghanistan. Our CIA is going to be there training a lot of people, and then later on, when the United States is in the Middle East, a lot of people that we trained to fight against the Soviet Union are going to be fighting against the United States when we invade Iraq and Afghanistan after 9/11. Anywho. So yeah, that's a little grab bag of the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And now what we'll do next is we'll look at civil rights individually and Vietnam individually.